that kind of life, and I was an empire builder, very simply. That's the best way I labeled myself. Well, with it all, although it looked awfully good on paper, there was something wrong inside about it. I don't think I'm yet ready to be able to label, because I'm probably not free enough to be able to have objective understanding of it. To be able to label what really didn't feel right, I can give you some clues about what didn't feel right. One of the problems was I was teaching these very hip courses at Harvard. I was teaching Freud and human motivation, personality development, and clinical psychology. And all of these students would come seeking my wisdom. And the problem was that I knew I didn't know. I mean, I knew everything you had to know in order to be a professor of psychology at Harvard. But when you got down to the nitty-gritty of what had something to do with people's lives, I knew that it all didn't add up right, because I had these various roles. I was a researcher studying child development, and so I could see how the variables we were working with didn't quite get to what that kid was all about. Then I was a therapist, and so many hours a week I had somebody sitting on the other side of the desk, and he was playing patient, I was playing doctor, and I would sit and I'd run through my list of theories as he would run through his list of symptoms, and we'd compare them and match them up, and you know, it wasn't enough. It didn't quite gel. It was as if psychology had a reason to be as defensive as it was. Because as if behaviorism hadn't quite gotten hold of the critical variables in the human experience. And I looked around, I looked at my colleagues, my psychological and psychiatric colleagues, and they seemed to be really just about as neurotic as anybody else. And they would come and they would be psychologists from 9 to 5, and then they would go home, and they seemed to be roughly as hung up in their marriages. Their children seemed to be as destructive as other people's children. They seemed to show the same personality manifestations. And it seemed a fair question that if all of these theories were so good and these people were the masters of them, why wasn't it reflected in their own human behavior? Now, I had really tried. I had gone through 5 years of psychoanalysis, and most people hide behind that and say, well, it was a didactic analysis. That is, I did it so that I could help others. It's a teaching thing. I didn't do it. I did it because I was neurotic. And I paid because I was sick and I wanted to get well. Because I knew that I wasn't making it in the world the right way, even though all the credits were, you know, the byline had all the credits. But at the end of 5 years of psychoanalysis, it was apparent that since I knew a lot about Freud and could keep pointing out to my analyst where he was making misinterpretations on the basis of a 1906 paper or something like that, that my defenses were at least as strong as his tools. That's all that's all that roughly $25,000 demonstrated to me. I hope those of you that are invested in those particular professional roles will appreciate that I'm probably still merely acting out my negative transference. And as far as the other things in my life, if you take the motorcycle, when I first got the motorcycle, I loved to climb hills with a motorcycle and do hill climbing races and go roaring off into the night in the California hills at 95 miles an hour. A girl holding onto the back and the wind blowing and holding on for dear life, and there was a thrill. There was something that was very great, and it would, at the moment, there would be a moment when it would just feel, just that place would feel good inside. That was about one moment. Then all the rest of the time it was cold, you know, or it was rainy. And so after the newness wore off, the motorcycle sat in the garage, and the airplane sat out at the landing strip. Because after a while, each of the things, the possibilities of each of those vehicles for giving me that thing I was looking for inside had been explored. And they were very finite, and I had appreciated what their limits were. Now, it was at this time that, just as this, I was settling into working for my tenure. That is, I was told, if you get your publications in order, we're holding a chair for you. Which meant, you know, publish or perish. Get those books out. Look good on paper. And so I was doing just that. And although it was a little discouraging to see that I already saw that this wasn't going to make it in life, and yet this was my commitment for the next 40 years. Now, I had a big corner office at Harvard with 2 secretaries and about 40 research assistants, and as I say, I was an empire builder. And down the hall, in a little closet-like place, there was this other guy who had come back from Italy, who had been riding a bicycle around Italy and had been found by the chairman of the department, who brought him back as the new bright thing for the department, and his name was Timothy Leary. And he was a fun-loving, drinking Irishman. And we were bachelors, and so we started to share evenings together, and he said he was going to Mexico in the summer, and I said that I'd like to come down too, and that we ought to take a trip across the north of South America in a little plane. And I told him I flew, which wasn't exactly true. I had a student license at the time. And he said, great, then we would meet in Cuernavaca on a certain date, and we would take off from there. So I then secretly went out and got my license, and then nobody would trust me with a plane, so I had to buy one. The bank bought it, actually. And off I went with the license 1 day old for this hair-raising trip, believe me, quite hair-raising trip over the mountains into southern Mexico, into central Mexico. Well, when I got there, Tim had just had this experience in which he had taken the sacred mushrooms of Mexico, which he had gotten from a woman called Crazy Juana, a curandero up in the hills, who would put one in your hand and 2 in her mouth. And I heard many stories about what had happened to him in this experience. There weren't any more of the mushrooms around, and we didn't take the trip across South America. We just hung out down in Tepoztlan and Cuernavaca. And then we flew back to the United States together in the plane with his son and an iguana. And I went to Berkeley, so I couldn't do anything more. And he went back to Harvard to start exploring these chemicals, because he said he had learned more in this one experience than he had in all of his years as a psychologist. So when I came back to Harvard in the spring, I was quite eager to have this experience. And he had gotten hold of the synthetic of these called psilocybin. So on March 6th in 1961, it was the night of the biggest snowstorm of the year, and my parents' home was about 2 blocks away from Tim's big house. And I went to my parents to visit, and then I trudged through the snow and went over to Tim's house to turn on, which we did in the kitchen with a variety of assorted people in our usual highly controlled manner. And the first part of the experience had that certain unpredictability about it, that Tim's son's dog had been out running in the snow and came in, and in our timeless minds it seemed like it was gasping for breath too long, and we thought it was going to die. And it was by then 12 o'clock midnight Saturday night in a raging blizzard, and we imagined ourselves carrying this dog to the veterinarian 4 miles away, when we weren't even sure the dog, it wasn't just us. So we called his son down from upstairs to ask him to see how he would act with the dog. And he came down, the dog played with him, so we assumed everything was all right. And then I went off into the other room, and I was sitting in the living room by myself after all of this tragicomic, hallucinatory revelry. I was sitting in the semi-darkness. The light came in from the street. It was snowing, and it was very beautiful. And I was sitting there, and suddenly, in the dark across the room, I saw a figure standing there. And as I looked more closely, I realized that the figure was myself. It was dressed in a cap and gown, strangely enough. And what I saw was my professorness across the room. It was what you call in psychology, what I called at that time, a dissociative experience. And so I looked at this professorness, and I said, well, it wasn't me any longer. I mean, I was here, and there was it. And I said, well, I guess I don't really need that anymore. And I sat back and relaxed. And the minute I said I don't need that anymore, the figure changed, and it was somebody else. And I sat forward, and there I was again, except now I was the young cosmopolite. My cosmopoliteness was sitting over there. All right, well, I guess I can do without that. Sat back. And in a sequence went by all of my social roles. Loverness, wise man, kind person, all of my roles. And each one, okay, well, too bad about that one, there it goes. And then went by Richard Alpertness. Now, this was another matter, you see. This was who I learned to be way back then, and I wasn't at all sure what happened when you gave that up. And I went through my mind the thought, what have I taken with this drug this madman Leary has given me? See, it's already his fault. And what's clearly going to happen now is that I'm going to be an amnesia case, because I'm losing my identity. I won't know who I am. All right, well, I can always get another social identity. I went through this thought process. I'll give up Richard Alpertness. At least I have my body. But as those of you that have experimented in this world know, I had spoken prematurely. Because as I looked down at the couch, nothing below my knees was visible any longer. And as I watched slowly, it all disappeared until it was only the couch on which I was sitting. Now, the kind of panic I experienced at that time has been reported usually in the tabloids as the dire consequences of irresponsible use of psychedelic chemicals. Because there was nothing in my model of the universe that led me to believe that if I was not in my body, there would be anything left. So as far as I was concerned, I was dying or ceasing to exist. That was it. And I recall the feeling. I recall the adrenaline flowing. I recall the sweat breaking out. I recall wanting to scream out for help. I recall all those feelings. And as the panic was mounting in whatever it is that it was mounting in, since I wasn't seeing anything, obviously, a voice inside of me said very quietly and rather jocularly, it seemed to me, in view of the gravity of the situation, but who's minding the store? And I became aware at that moment that although everything by which I knew myself was gone, still there was something in me that was watching this whole process disappear. There was what I at the time was calling a scanning device or a point of awareness, something in there that had no reference to body, no reference to personality, no reference to any of my social roles, and yet there it was, clear and lucid and watching the whole thing and just, watching it all happen. And the minute I defined it or labeled it or named it, I experienced a tremendous exhilaration, a tremendous feeling of liberation. jumping up and I ran out into the snow and danced in the snow. And then later I recall going back through the drifts to my parents' home around 5 in the morning and deciding as a young tribal buck that I would shovel the snow in the front. And I was shoveling, and my parents came to the window and opened the window and said, "You damned idiot, come in, you don't shovel snow in the middle of the night." And I looked up and I heard this voice, which was the kind of voice of external sanction to which I had always responded, since that's how I got to be where I was. And I listened to the voice inside, and the voice inside says, "It's cool if you want to shovel snow, it's all right, nothing immoral about that. It's all right." And I looked up at them and I smiled and I danced a bit of a jig and I went back to shoveling. And the window closed and I saw them smiling behind it. Well, now I was presented with a peculiar dilemma. Because the next Monday, when I had to get up and give my lectures in human motivation, the theory of ego psychology, which I was expected to present as a responsible member of the psychological community, I saw was not adequate to the experience that I had had. Because that place that I had gone to, I couldn't find it in the book. I couldn't find it in the book anywhere. Freud's unconscious had too much to do with the uniqueness of the individual and too much to do with personality qualities. Even Jung's collective unconscious wasn't quite the place, as I later explored more carefully. And I couldn't find the words to tell anybody about what had happened. And I hid behind what we all got to use quite frequently of, this was an ineffable experience, right? I'd like to tell you about it, but it's ineffable. Sorry. Namaste. Welcome to an evening under the breast of the Divine Mother. So graceful to share the journey. We've been on the journey a long time together now. We've gone through a lot of stages. Just as in any journey, some people have dropped along the way, said, well, I think I've gone far enough for this round. Others have been waiting for us to catch up. The journey passes through the 7 valleys, 7 kingdoms, the chakras, planes of consciousness, degrees of faith, have been at a certain place when we pass beyond it. Because when we're in it, we don't have the perspective to know, because we are only being. But as the journey progresses, less and less do you need to know. The faith is strong enough so it is sufficient to be. It's a journey towards simplicity. It's a journey towards quietness. It's a journey towards a kind of joy that is not in time. It's a journey out of time. It's a journey leaving behind every model that we have had of who we are. It's a journey that involves the transformation of our beings such that our thinking mind becomes our servant rather than our master. It's a journey that's taken us from primary identification with our body through identification with our psyche, ultimately to an identification with our souls, and finally to an identification with God. And because many of us have traversed this path without maps, thinking that it was unique to us because of the peculiar way and time in which we were traveling. Although, in truth, every historical moment has been unique in the same way.